Hey everybody, welcome to part one of our discussion on the Aztecs. This discussion covers the information that you read and took notes over yesterday. So some of this will be review, some of it might be some new concepts as well. So make sure you're paying close attention and answering the questions along the way. So the Aztec people began as nomadic hunters and gatherers. So let's break that down. Nomadic means they're moving. So they're constantly moving. They don't stay in one place. And hunter gatherers means they hunted their meat and they gathered their some food, so some fruits and berries and some grasses. So they were nomadic hunters and gatherers. They originally occupied the northwest desert of Mexico. But again, as they're nomadic, they're constantly on the move and they moved south. And so they entered this land known as the Valley of Mexico. And it is a mountain basin. Okay, you know what a valley is. So it's the Valley of Mexico is a mountain basin, so at the bottom of the mountain. So when they get into this area, they're looking for a place to settle. Now the problem is all the fertile land in this valley of Mexico has already been taken up by different groups of people. So the Aztecs continued their search, and according to legend, the Aztec sun and war god told them that their new home, as they're searching for this new home, the location, they would find an eagle with a serpent in its mouth, which is a snake. So an eagle sitting perched on top of a pear cactus. And so that's what legend is. So they found this eagle with the serpent on top of the pear cactus. And so they declared this their land. And so they settled in this area. So look at the map. It's actually an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and it is an island. And they established the city known as Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan. Okay, so they and this city was established around 1325 A.D. Okay, they began to build their settlement here. They developed a kind of a working relationship to the people around them because the Aztecs were skilled warriors. So they would kind of other cities would pay them to protect their city. So the Aztecs used this to gain wealth. All right, but Tenochtitlan, the city really grew, and it grew. Now the problem it's an island, so there's not a lot of land for farming, not a lot of land for agriculture. Okay, so they had to come up with a way. They had to adapt to their environment. They had to change the way they were living in order to fit their environment. So they developed and learned to construct these floating gardens known as chinampas. So these chinampas, again, are raised garden beds on the lake. They're these floating gardens. Okay, and how they were built is they would connect to the bedrock, the soil of the lake, as you see in the illustration, the diagram. So the roots would be connected to the bottom of the lake. And they would never have to really water their crops because evaporation from the lake would water it for them. So they had kind of this built-in system, which is pretty interesting. So they had to adapt, and this is the way they adapt. They built chinampas. Okay. On these chinampas, they grew many crops such as corn, which I have a photo of at the bottom, uh, beans, squash, chili peppers. Okay, so they really prospered once they adapted to their environment. They also hunted animals that lived around the island as well. So, so Tenochtitlan really grew into a large city, and at its height, it was home to roughly 200,000 to 400,000 people. So, if you look at um, this diagram of the city, okay, some of this we'll talk about later on, like temple. When we talk about religion and the calendar, we'll talk about all that later on. And the ball court, we'll talk about. So as you see over here, we have um, the chinampas. Okay, you have canals. This is a network of waterways to get in and out of the city. All right, so it was common transportation was boats. Right, you have canals, you have waterways, so you need boats. It is a walled city, as you can see, a great big city. They also had causeways, and causeways are raised roads that allowed the people to easily travel over the swampy and wet areas. So if you see, it's kind of like a large sidewalk. Okay, there was three of them um, going in and out of the city. Okay, they needed these causeways and these canals because you can grow so much things agriculturally, which means through farming, but you also need other things to survive. And so the Aztecs needed to trade. So they traded with the other people around them. So that's why they needed the canals and the transportation system, the waterway, and the causeways, the raised roads. Okay, because they wanted to expand their um, economic system. So they traded. They traded with things that they could not find locally in Tenochtitlan. So things like wood, right? You're living on an island, all right? So wood and stone for building. Okay, so and so they had to trade as well. So here's a just an example, just an illustration of them trading. Okay, very basic illustration. So the Aztecs. Um, so if you look at the map, it starts. This is Lake Texcoco. You see this red star that I'm circling right now. That's Tenochtitlan, but it eventually expands. And look at all the red. So it starts as one city, but the Aztec city settlement turned into an empire. Okay, the Aztec civilization turned into an empire. And they turned into an empire throughout the years by making friends, by creating these alliances with other cities, or because Aztecs were so much of skilled warriors, they would take the land from the people. Okay, so they grew their empire either by alliances, or these friendships with these partnerships with these cities, or through force by using their skilled warriors. At its height, so at its peak, the Aztec Empire held about 6 to 12 million people under its rule. So the Aztec Empire went from one city to a 6 to 12 million people empire, which is just vast amount of land and people. one thing that the Aztecs did to continue to support the empire, to pay for projects, to pay for the skilled warriors, and to train them and to supply the weapons, is they made each of the people they conquered pay a tribute. And a tribute is a forced payment. All right, so if you watch the Hunger Games, you know that they took people as tribute from each district, like a sacrifice, a forced payment. So that's what the Aztecs did. They not necessarily, the tribute wasn't people, though sometimes it was, and we'll talk about that when we talk about religion on Friday. But it would oftentimes be in the form of goods, gold, goods such as corn and gold and jade. Okay, so they collected tribute from their conquered people. So from one city, Tenochtitlan, which grew, and then now over the years they grew into a large empire. Okay, the Aztecs did become a civilization, and we know about the 8 characteristics of a civilization. So the one that you read about yesterday was the social structure of the Aztec Empire, the Aztec civilization. So it's 3 classes. You have the noble class, the intermediate class, or the intermediate's easy to remember because that's the in-between class, and the commoners. So at the very top of the social structure is the emperor or the king. And he gained his power because, number 1, he controlled the military. He was the head of the military. And number 2, the king or the emperor gained his power because of the Aztec religious beliefs. He was believed to be a god. So he's at the top. And then right underneath in the noble class are the priest. Okay, so that tells you that the Aztecs valued religion, right? Because at the top is the king, and then the priests are right underneath in the same noble class. And then you have the intermediate class, which is merchants. Merchants are people who trade. They're the traders. And then you have skilled artisans. Those are people who make goods and products. So you have people who make the goods and products, and people who trade the goods and products are in that intermediate class. And then the commoners. So you have land-owning farmers, fishers, craftspeople, and soldiers are in the commoners. Then underneath them are the landless workers called serfs. So serfs is the name of people who did not own land. They just usually worked on other people's land. Then underneath them, you have enslaved people. Enslaved people are at the bottom. Now, when we think of slavery and enslaved people, we think of the United States version when they forced Africans to the United States and forced them into slavery. The Aztecs had a different form of slavery where the enslaved people were prisoners of war. So when the Aztecs went and conquered a people, they would take the prisoners of war and enslave them. Okay? And the enslaved people were also used as human sacrifices. And that, again, we will talk about tomorrow. A human sacrifice to the gods. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about are these arrows, which you had on your notes as well. As you go up the social structure of the Aztecs, so as you go up, you have more power and less people. So the noble class has more power and less people than the intermediate class. And the intermediate class has more power and less people than the commoners. And then it's inverted the other way. So the noble class has more power, less people. So as you go up, you increase power, decrease people. And as you go down, you decrease the power, but you increase the people. So the king has the most power, enslaved people have the least amount of power. Okay, here's part 1 of our discussion